This is Join Us in France, episode 211. Bonjour, I'm Annie, and Join Us in France is the podcast where we talk about France, its many quirks, its history, its language, and of course, destinations in France you want to learn about, because hopefully you'll be visiting soon. On today's episode, a review of 7 World War I sites in France that memorialize soldiers from English-speaking countries and Commonwealth countries in honor of the World War I Armistice Centennial coming up in just a few days on November 11th. Join Us in France is brought to you by Patreon supporters and Addicted to France, the small group tour company for people who want to enjoy France to the fullest with no stress. Check out our upcoming tour in September 2019, which is open for booking until Boxing Day this year. Stay tuned at the end of the episode for audio feedback and also some feedback on last week's episode about people who hate Paris. Starting with episode 212, so next week, I'll be changing the release day of the podcast back to Sundays. I'll aim for Sundays at 6 p.m. French time, so if you're in the US and you're subscribed to the podcast, new episodes will appear midday, more or less, on Sundays. If you're new to the show, I want to extend a special welcome to you and invite you to visit joinusinfrance.com and make good use of the search feature to find if we've talked about places you're interested in. Chances are we are, because we've talked about a lot of places and we have a lot of back episodes. The World War I Centennial is coming up, and I wanted to mark the occasion by telling you about a few of the places you might want to visit in France if you're interested in World War I history. World War I. It's hard for my French mouth to say that in English. And even if you don't want to make World War I the theme of your trip, there are places that are worth a visit if you're near Lille, Amiens, Arras, Verdun, and the north of France and Alsace in general. We haven't talked about most of these places yet on the show. They are not the most touristy places in France, which doesn't mean that they're not interesting if you're in the mood for something off the beaten track. We'll mostly talk about sites that are in the Somme area, in the Hauts-de-France region. Straight drive north from Paris, but also one near Verdun, which is not at all in the same area. That's closer to Alsace. The theme of this episode is important World War I memorial sites in France that are of interest to English speakers. I picked some of them because they are huge and really famous, and others because I found them touching and I would like to see them myself. I will not try to mention all of them, obviously. This is by no means exhaustive. Just my selection that I did this week. We will probably have other episodes that mention other places in the future. These are memorials dedicated to British, Australian, and American soldiers, plus Commonwealth countries that sent troops, which include New Zealand, South Africa. I can't name them all. India. I mean, a lot of countries have sent troops to fight in World War I. There are, of course, lots of memorials to French soldiers in France as well. They're outside of the scope of what I've decided to talk about today, but you will see many of them as you drive around France. As a matter of fact, every French town and village has a memorial to World War I and World War II. When I was doing some research on this, I realized that there aren't a lot of people searching for World War I, and I thought maybe I shouldn't even do an episode about this because, well, if nobody's searching for it, but you know what? World War I changed France forever. You can't really understand this country if you ignore this topic completely. And the other reason why I hesitated to do this episode is because it's really complicated to put together. There are thousands of sites. I haven't visited most of them yet, but on the other hand, if it's complicated, that's a good reason to dig in and help you sort it out. And honestly, I'm not ready to forget. Every person you meet in France has grandfathers or great-grandfathers who served in World War I, including myself. Both of my grandfathers did. They called everybody to fight in this war. Almost every French soldier had to serve in Verdun alone because the conditions there were so awful. They rotated soldiers in and out to reduce the number of suicides. World War I is in France's DNA, even though it ended 100 years ago. For those of you who are in Paris now and through early 2019, the Army Museum, Musée de l'Armée, has 2 exhibits dedicated to World War I right now. That's where Napoleon is interred, right? The Napoleon tomb. One is free, and it's called Immersion 14-18, Immersion 14-18. That's what French people call this war. You walk outside the dome, so the beautiful Golden Dome in Paris. You walk outside of that dome with an app that you install on your phone. It's free. And as you walk around the map, it tells you about things that happened in specific places. So that's going on until January 20th, 2019. The second exhibit costs 12 euros. It's also at the Musée de l'Armée, same place, but it's indoors. It's a small exhibit that has packs in a lot of big punch, I guess. Museum curators borrowed important artifacts from 25 countries that were involved in World War I. The exhibit is called À l'Est, la guerre sans fin, because while World War I ended on November 11th, 1918 in France, it kept going in many other countries. In Hungary, the treaty they signed at the end of the war is still a political hot potato because Hungary lost 2/3 of its territories in those treaties. And that particular exhibit has a lot to do with the Eastern Front of World War I. This war was huge. It was everywhere. And I'll go to see both of those when I go to Paris for some business after Thanksgiving. So, what were the major battles of World War I in France? Well, there are 3. The first one is the First Battle of the Marne in September 1914. There were about 750,000 casualties. Then the second one is the Battle of the Somme. That's early July to November 1916. Over 1 million casualties. And that's the one where we'll be spending time today. And the third is the Battle of Verdun in February through December 1916, 700,000 casualties. The Marne is a river. It's 500 kilometers long, and it looks like an arc, kinda. It goes roughly between the southern part of Alsace all the way to Paris, where it meets up with the Seine River. There are battles all along the river because the Germans wanted to capture Paris right away. And it was mostly French casualties, so we won't talk about that much today. The Somme is also a river. It's half the length. It's around 250 kilometers long, and it flows east to west, north of Paris. So it starts east of Amiens and goes all the way to the English Channel, and we'll mostly talk about that area. And the third major area of World War I battlefield in France is Verdun. It's a city a little bit west of Metz and not far from the Franco-German border. We talked about it on episode 205. It'll come up again a little bit today. So, here's my list of 7 memorial places I think are worth a visit for English speakers who are visiting France and want to learn about World War I. Pozières. Pozières is, well, if you're driving north from Paris, you'll get to Pozières in about 2 hours. It's about 40 minutes drive northeast of Amiens. This is mostly a British cemetery, which commemorates over 14,000 British casualties in this area. There are also some South African, Irish and Australians buried there, as well as many other Commonwealth nationalities and unknown soldiers. This is a cemetery with white stone and peaceful green grass. You can walk between the rows of graves and see how young most of these men were. But it's right off of a major road, and there's a great parking lot, so all the tour buses stop there. It can get pretty busy at times, but it's still very peaceful because there's enough separation between the road and the cemetery. It's a must-stop for people visiting World War I sites in France. This is a cemetery and a memorial, so no museum, but it's well worth a stop. The second one is Villers-Bretonneux. It's not far from Pozières. It would make sense to see both on the same day. There are 3 things you can do there. You can see the Villers-Bretonneux Australian National Memorial. So that's Anzacs, and it's Australian and New Zealand. It's a beautiful white stone memorial and cemetery dedicated to the unidentified Australian soldiers. The Monash Centre is nearby. This is a recent museum that shows multimedia presentation. You bring your smartphone and some earbuds if you have them, or you could rent some there too. It's really informative, easy to understand what happened because of how they present it. And this is one that I would definitely want to go see. The third thing you can see at Villers-Bretonneux is the Franco-Australien Museum. It's nearby. It's spelled in French. It's closer to the town of Villers-Bretonneux. It is housed in a former school building that's been renovated. It's pretty small, but still worth a visit. It displays a lot of memorabilia. Memorabilia, can I say that? Prints, very moving accounts of personal items, and that sort of thing. It's a French museum, so like most French museums, it assumes that you know a lot and you just want to see the artifacts. I'm sure that's true for some of you, maybe not for everyone, but if you have an hour, it's worth stopping there. Okay, now moving on to another place, Fromelles. This is the only all-Australian cemetery in France. Fromelles is about 2.5 hours north of Paris, near Lille, and it's part of the Battle of the Somme. This is the place where Australians entered into the fighting for World War I. Many of these soldiers used to be in a mass grave. They have now been identified by DNA, and the Australian families know at last for sure what happened to their relatives. The memorial is done really tastefully. It provides an information booklet that's very informative, if you read it, that is, and a museum where you'll learn about the Anzacs and the battles that took place in this area. This is a must-see, especially for Australians. Next one is Bullecourt. There are several things you can visit near Bullecourt. The Musée Jean et Denise Le Taille. This is a private collection of a French family who is passionate about keeping the memory of Commonwealth soldiers who gave their lives in France alive. It's a small museum, but it has a great audio guide and it is inspiring. It's staffed by volunteers and they have limited hours, so check their website before you go. Not too far from the museum is a Bullecourt digger. It's a statue set in a beautiful field where terrible battles took place over 100 years ago. The sculptor is Australian Peter Collett, and it features the face of his father, who fought at Bullecourt. Like many of these memorials, it is not super showy, but it stands for a lot of suffering and respect, and this is one I would really like to see as well. In the same vein, and also in Bullecourt, you have the Slouch Hat Memorial. This whole area had been taken, lost, and retaken 19 times. By the end, there was nothing left. And yet, the village is back, along with memorials to the memory of the 10,000, mostly Australians, who gave their lives there. And when you're in Bullecourt, you're pretty close to Arras, which has the Wellington tunnels, and Thiepval, I think you say Thiepval. I won't go into those because we talked about them in episode 205, but they are also definitely worth a visit. Now, American World War I memorials in France, there aren't as many because Americans didn't send as many troops, but there's the Somme American Cemetery. It's in Bonny, in the Somme battle, Bonny, B-O-N-Y. It's near Amiens. It's not huge, but it looks like a wonderful memorial place. There's also the Montfaucon American Monument. This is the last thing I'm going to mention today. The Montfaucon American Monument. That one is not at all in the same area. It's near Verdun, so Alsace area. But if you're visiting the Verdun Memorial and you're American, I think you might want to stop there as well. One more thing I want to mention before I close is the Spanish flu. World War I killed millions, but the Spanish flu probably killed even more. Probably between 50 and 100 million casualties. Well, deaths. These are not even casualties. There was no injury. It's you either survived it or you died. So between 50 and 100 million dead from the Spanish flu. It started in the spring of 1918, just as the war was ending. And it went on until the fall of 1819. And talk about a double whammy. This 1918 flu strain was particularly nasty because it killed mostly people between 15 and 35, and also pregnant women. So if you had survived the war, maybe the flu got you. Women who didn't fight in battle but got pregnant as soon as their soldier husbands got home died in droves. There were French villages where during the second half of October 1918, half of the women between 15 and 35 died in the span of 2 weeks. So it was really awful. So here we are in 2018, 100 years later, thinking about a war that ended 100 years ago. We have no world war in progress right now. We have no virulent strain of flu this year. And we are very lucky. So to conclude, there you have it. Just a few places for you to visit and commemorate World War I and pay respects to the soldiers from your country who fought and died in France. There are some spectacular memorials in Belgium too, by the way, but I'm not going to talk about them because it's a different country. But when you visit the northeast corner of France, you'll run into a lot of memorials and monuments and small museums. World War I is just as omnipresent in the northeast of France as World War II is in Normandy. And I think it's wonderful that so many people who've done trip reports with me talked about visiting war memorials with their kids. I think if you want your kids to understand history and have it be more than some boring theoretical subject, it's great to take them to war memorial sites if you get the opportunity. Thank you, Sonia Lensick Duffy, Christine Hegarty, and Kelly Kirk for pledging to support the show on Patreon this week. And my thanks also to all the other patrons who support the show month after month. Thank you so much for giving back. To support the show on Patreon, go to patreon.com/join us. I'm at 136 patrons this week, down 2 from weeks ago. You can support the show for as little as $2 per month. Please chip in. The lack of progress on the number of patrons is extremely discouraging to me. So I would like to remind you why you should pledge. I really want to continue to bring you the best of France and share my passion for France travel done right. I also want to keep featuring podcast listeners who had a great time in France and want to help others do the same. But a lot of work goes on behind the scenes. The more popular the podcast gets, the more time and money I have to spend on it. So for a donation of $5 a month, which perspective is everything. It wouldn't even be enough to buy you one breakfast in Paris. You get 2 rewards. The French History Brief, where I go in depth about one aspect of French history, and also Lunch Break French. It's a piece that I write and I read it both in French and in English. So this is for people who want to work their ears to understand French better. And I'm thinking of adding a classic French recipe each month as well, because I want to test a lot of these recipes myself. So donors at the $2 level get a couple of my best photos of France each month. And when I add the classic French recipe, they'll get that too. Patreon is the best way to donate because it's a predictable recurring income for me, even if it's just $2 from you. Having said that, you can also make a one-time donation. If everyone who uses the show to prepare their trip to France chipped in $20, which is the price of one guidebook, that would be wonderful. It would be enough to support the show going forward for sure. And while you might think that podcasts are free, they are only free for you. It's not free for me. There are costs associated with doing this podcast. It's about $100 a month right now. And of course, my time. So visit joinusinfrance.com/support to support the show on Patreon or donate. And thank you very much. Next week on Join Us in France, a trip report with Sarah Root about spending a whole month in France with her kids. We talked about spending time in Provence, the Dordogne, the Loire Valley, and Paris. They had a lovely time. I had a great time talking to Sarah. She was really fun. I think she'll inspire you as you wonder what to do with your kids in France. And remember, that episode will come out on a Sunday, not on Wednesday. I'm changing the release schedule from Wednesday to Sunday going forward. For my personal update, well, we had a great time in London. We lucked out. We got good weather. It only rained and hailed for 10 minutes over 3 days. That's a bargain for London. I've had much, much worse weather in London. London is such a vibrant city full of people from all over the world. I loved it. It was so easy to find places where some of us could get, vegan food while others indulge in fish and chips. That's really hard to do in France. I hope it's going to get better soon. It seems that French people are catching on, that maybe, like everything else, it'll start in the big cities and then it'll move down slowly to the rural places. Anyway, in London, no problem. The food wasn't spectacular, but you had choices, which is really good. We stayed at a Premier Inn near Euston Station, which was a really easy location and a comfortable hotel. It's Premier Inn. It's nothing fancy, just comfortable and predictable, which is what I like. It's right next to the British Library, that particular hotel, so I had to go in there. What a wonderful place the British Library is. They have a room called Treasures of the British Library, where they show some of their most amazing items. It's wonderful if you don't have a lot of time. I really could have spent a few hours looking at beautiful documents from the Middle Ages, but alas, family was waiting. So next time I'll plan for 2 or 3 hours at the British Library. We saw Matilda the Musical. It was absolutely brilliant. I can't believe how talented the children and actors are in this play. Singers, actors, dancers. I mean, they do it all. They are unbelievable. But somebody has to explain to Tim Minchin that, he's brilliant. He's the guy who wrote it. That he packs too many words in his sentences. It goes so fast. But it's brilliant music, brilliant choreography, and we had a great time. The cast for Matilda is mostly kids. That's what the show is about. And they are so good. I had the song Revolting Children stuck in my head yesterday all day because I listened to it right after I woke up. That was the end of that. We also went to the Tate Museum, and that's the only thing I really didn't like so much. The view from the top of the building is amazing, and it's wonderful that they show pieces from both men and women artists. Again, that's not something we're doing in France yet. Most art museums show mostly men. But the problem is, my problem is with modern art. I find it pretentious and meaningless. It's probably because I lack imagination, but I don't know. Elise keeps telling me that people said the same thing about Monet's work. But honestly, Monet had genuine skill, How much skill does it take to hang 3 white canvases on a wall? Like, how about straight lines of color, like in 3 colors? To me, that just shows that the artist knew the right people and was good at creating buzz. Is that what they're trying to say? Look at me, I'm good at creating buzz. Is that the art today? I don't know. Anyway, I'd love your thoughts on that in the comments for this episode. There are 2 sides to the Tate. Well, 2 sides, no, two towers things. We went on the side where the elevator goes all the way up to the beautiful open-air terrace. And that's this. So from the terrace, we went up to the terrace and then we walked down. And that's the side that has the most weird, edgy stuff. The other side has more modern art like Picasso and Braque and, people like that, which I do love. So we didn't have time to do both. Might have to go back to the Tate to see the other side. We'll see. We also went to the British Museum. I saw the Rosetta Stone again. There were a lot of people in front of it. So we went to Egyptian art, and there were also a lot of people for that. But my goodness, what amazing art the Egyptians did. They have little statuettes in this blue. It's like a special, really bright blue. It's beautiful. It was just stunning. And it's 4,000 years old. And by the way, like I mentioned, the British Museum is more packed than the Louvre by a lot. I mean, at the Louvre, when you enter, you have a lot of people at the entrance. But then, and you have a lot of people around the Italian, where the Mona Lisa is and stuff like that. And Winged Victory and that stuff. But as soon as you get away from those in the Louvre, it's lovely. It's mostly empty. The British Museum is much smaller than the Louvre, and it's packed everywhere, it seems to me. But we still loved it, so do go. And last but not least, we went to the Universal Studios Harry Potter experience, and that was so much fun. We're all hopeless Harry Potter fans in my family. It's a little hard to get tickets. You have to book a long time in advance. But if you go, I recommend you try to book a ticket early and go early afternoon or in the morning, because the only thing that was left was like 6:30 p.m. And entering that late, it takes a good 3 hours. And I probably could have spent 4 hours in there. But it was going to close, and the last bus to take us back to, I can't remember the name of the place where it takes you to take the train. Anyway, there's a bus. The last bus was leaving, and we were worried. So at the end, we went a little too fast. But luckily for us, Netflix in France has just released all the Harry Potter movies. So I've been watching, more or less an hour every night, because they're long movies. They're like 2.5 hours, most of them. So I've been watching like an hour Harry Potter every night while I brush the dogs. What a team. I mean, they had such a team of talented people to make these movies. They are wonderful. My favorite so far is the third movie. I must say that one is like, whew. Anyway, London did not disappoint. We were only there for 3 days, but it was wonderful. And I really look forward to my next visit there. But again, I lived there for 2 years. Now, that was years ago, back when I was young and I was a travel agent in London. But I still remember, like the underground and stuff. I kind of have a feel for where I'm going, and I never feel lost, in London. And the London Underground is quite easy to navigate, probably easier than the Paris Underground. But of course, that might be because I lived there for 2 years. Anyway, this personal update is running long, so I'll save something else that happened to me for next week. I had a run-in with a hunter in my little village, and I'll tell you all about that in the next episode, because it says a lot about how France works. So the show notes and photos for this episode are on joinusinfrance.com/211, the number. I would love you to visit joinusinfrance.com/support as well. And if you're interested in World War I in France, you should also check out episode 205, a trip report about World War I battlefields in France. And check out also the French history page. When you go to the site, you go under interests and then French history. Join Us in France is on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest, and also YouTube, Spotify, and smart speakers. If you want to enable Join Us in France for smart speakers, you say the name, the A name, Alexa, and you say, blah, blah, enable Join Us in France. And you'll be done. And I'm working on getting added into another audio giant, but I can't talk about it yet. So when you tell people that you know who enjoy France, who are planning a visit to France about the show, tell them they can find us anywhere. They just need to search for Join Us in France. And if you want to recognize other show listeners while visiting Paris, check out our t-shirts and tote bags. Look for the green button on joinusinfrance.com. That will take you to the merchandise store. For those of you who are subscribed to the email list, you haven't heard from me in a while. I'll get back to it next year, I hope. I have too many people on the list. I'm going to have to start paying for list management, and I'm trying to see if the donations are going to come in a little more. The comments are broken on the new site. I know this. The old version of the site had a ton of comments. Some of them are not displaying correctly. You can't add new comments. Anyway, we're working on it. My husband's working on it, and hopefully it'll get fixed soon. I'm so glad my husband does this for free, obviously, because if I had to pay a developer to fix those things, that would be the end of the show, because that would cost way too much money. Okay, some feedback from the last episode. Many of you told me on Facebook that it's possible to have data included in your American sale plan. That's wonderful. I didn't realize it when I was recording a couple weeks ago. That must be a fairly new development. I hadn't heard of it so far. So I'm not going to tell you the specifics of the plans everybody talked about, because cell phone plans, they change all the time, but it's worth checking whether or not your plan includes data while you're in France, and definitely consider adding it if it doesn't. Also, you can ask your hotel if they can provide you with a hotspot device while you're touring Paris. Those are sometimes like 2 or 3 euros per day, and they work really well. And now I have some audio feedback to play from Wynne Charles. She's a fellow podcaster and the producer of Ask Wynne podcast. And as she says herself, she's a woman who has spent her entire life not allowing cerebral palsy to stop her from achieving her goals. And now she wants to visit France. That's wonderful. I'm glad this podcast is helping you make plans from Paris. Here's Wynne Charles.
Hey, Andy, it's Wynne from Aspen, Colorado. I don't know how I discovered doing this in France. I don't know how I discovered your podcast. But one of my bucket list trips, as soon as I get my journalism degree, is France and is doing Paris. So I'm doing my homework now, so to speak. And I love it, and I have it in my earbuds as I record this message. Thanks, Annie. Keep up the great work. Bye.
To connect with me, email Annie at joinusinfrance.com or leave a message at 1-801-806-1015. You can also ask to join the Join Us in France closed group on Facebook, and when you do, please answer all the questions. There's only 3, but lots of people just answer one of them and they think I'm going to let them in. No, I'm not. Have a great weekend of trip planning, and I'll talk to you next week on Sunday. Au revoir. The Join Us in France travel podcast is written and produced by Annie Sargent and copyright 2018 by Addicted to France. It is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.